I was standing in line at the commissary on base in Okinawa, Japan, when my phone buzzed with yet another email from someone named Patricia Hendricks, and the subject line made my blood pressure spike for the third time that week. My name is Connor Ashford, and I'm a staff sergeant in the United States Marine Corps. I'd been deployed overseas for 6 months at this point, doing my job, serving my country, and apparently committing the unforgivable sin of missing homeowners association meetings back in Florida. The email was the 5th one I'd received in 2 weeks, each one more aggressive than the last, demanding my attendance at the monthly HOA meeting and threatening fines if I didn't show up. I couldn't believe what I was reading. This woman actually expected me to fly back from a military deployment to attend a meeting about neighborhood landscaping standards. I'd bought my house in a quiet subdivision called Maple Ridge in Jacksonville, Florida, right before my deployment. It was a nice 3-bedroom ranch-style home with a decent yard, and I thought the HOA would be reasonable. The fees were low, the rules seemed standard, and the neighborhood looked well-maintained. What I hadn't counted on was Patricia Hendricks becoming the HOA president 2 months after I left for deployment. When I got back to my barracks that evening, I sat down and actually read through all of Patricia's emails carefully. The first one had been polite enough, just a reminder about the upcoming meeting. The second one had a slightly sharper tone, noting that I hadn't responded. The third one informed me that attendance at quarterly meetings was mandatory according to the HOA bylaws. The fourth one threatened a $50 fine for non-attendance. This fifth one, the one I just received, informed me that I was now being fined $100 for missing 2 consecutive meetings, and that if I didn't attend the next one in person, I'd face further penalties, including potential legal action. I immediately called my buddy Marcus, who lived 2 streets over from me in the same neighborhood. He picked up on the third ring, and I could hear his kids screaming in the background. "Connor, man, how's Japan treating you?" Marcus asked. "It's fine, but I need to ask you something about the HOA. Are you getting harassed by Patricia Hendricks?" There was a long pause, and then Marcus let out a tired sigh. "Dude, she's insane. She got elected president back in October and immediately started going on a power trip. She's been fining people left and right for the stupidest things. My neighbor got fined because his mailbox was the wrong shade of black. Another guy got hit with a violation because his grass was 2 inches too tall when he was out of town for a family emergency. She's threatening to fine me for not attending meetings. Marcus, I'm deployed. I'm in Japan. I literally cannot attend these meetings. That's completely insane even for her. Have you tried explaining that you're military?" I sent her one email back when she first started bothering me. I told her I was deployed overseas and wouldn't be back until May. She replied saying that deployment wasn't an excuse and that I could participate via video conference. Marcus laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "That's Patricia for you. She doesn't care about anyone's circumstances." You should see the neighborhood Facebook group. People are losing their minds. Someone started a petition to have her removed, but it needs a majority vote, and she's got a couple of her friends backing her up. We talked for a few more minutes before Marcus had to go deal with his kids. After hanging up, I sat on my bunk and stared at my phone. I needed to handle this, but I wasn't sure how. I decided to try the reasonable approach first, even though I had a feeling it wouldn't work. I composed a detailed email explaining my situation. I included my deployment orders with personal information redacted, explained that I was stationed in Okinawa with the Marines, and that I wouldn't be back stateside until May. I pointed out that, under the Service Members Civil Relief Act, I had certain protections while on active duty, and that threatening legal action against a deployed service member was not only inappropriate but potentially illegal. I kept my tone professional and respectful, even though what I really wanted to do was tell her exactly where she could shove her meeting attendance requirements. I hit send and tried not to think about it. I had actual work to do, actual responsibilities that mattered. For the next few days, I focused on my duties, worked out, and tried to enjoy what little downtime I had. But Patricia Hendricks wasn't done with me. Her reply came 3 days later, and it was even worse than I'd anticipated. She claimed that the Service Members Civil Relief Act didn't apply to HOA matters, that I had signed a contract when I purchased my home agreeing to abide by all HOA rules and regulations, and that my choice to be deployed didn't exempt me from my responsibilities as a homeowner. She also informed me that the fines would continue to accumulate and that she expected me to either attend in person or resign from the HOA board. I had to read that last part twice. Resign from the HOA board. I wasn't on the HOA board. I'd never been on the HOA board. I hadn't even attended a single meeting before deploying. I emailed her back immediately asking what she was talking about, and her response made me want to throw my phone across the room. Apparently, at the first meeting after I'd deployed, someone had nominated me for the position of treasurer. Since I wasn't there to decline, and since no one else wanted the position, I'd been voted in by default. Patricia claimed she'd sent me an email about it, which I'd never received, and that as a board member, my attendance wasn't just encouraged but required by the HOA governing documents. I went to my commanding officer the next morning. Captain Rodriguez was a fair man, tough but understanding, and he'd always been good about helping his Marines deal with problems back home. "Sir, I need some advice about a situation with my HOA," I said after he'd invited me into his office. He leaned back in his chair and gestured for me to continue. I explained the whole situation, showed him the emails, and watched his expression go from curious to annoyed to downright angry. "This woman is threatening a deployed Marine with legal action for not attending neighborhood meetings." He said slowly, "Yes, sir, and apparently I'm on their board now even though I never agreed to it and didn't even know about it until yesterday." Captain Rodriguez pulled out a notepad and started writing. "Okay, here's what we're going to do. First, you're going to contact JAG. The Judge Advocate General's office handles legal issues for service members, and they'll be able to advise you on your rights under the SCRA. Second, I'm going to write a letter on official letterhead confirming your deployment status and the fact that you are unable to return to the United States for non-emergency civilian matters. Third, you're going to document everything. Every email, every fine, every threat. If this woman continues to harass you, we'll escalate it. Thank you, sir. I really appreciate it. Connor, you're deployed. You're serving your country. You shouldn't have to deal with this kind of nonsense from back home. Let me make some calls." The meeting with JAG happened 2 days later. The attorney, a major named Sarah Chen, reviewed all of my documentation and shook her head in disbelief. "This is one of the more ridiculous cases I've seen," she said. "The Service Members Civil Relief Act absolutely applies here. Under Section 526, you can't be held in default on any obligation while you're on active duty. That includes HOA obligations. Furthermore, any fines or penalties imposed on you during your deployment can be challenged. The fact that they're claiming you're on their board without your knowledge or consent is also problematic." "So what should I do?" I asked. "I'm going to draft a letter citing the relevant sections of the SCRA and informing this HOA president that her actions are in violation of federal law." I'll also point out that continuing to harass a deployed service member could result in legal consequences for her and the HOA. We'll send it certified mail so there's a record of receipt. Major Chen was as good as her word. Within a week, a strongly worded letter on official JAG letterhead was sent to Patricia Hendricks and the Maple Ridge HOA board. It clearly outlined my rights under the SCRA, demanded that all fines be rescinded, and stated that I was formally declining any position on the HOA board. It also warned that any further harassment would result in a formal complaint being filed. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. Patricia's response came via email, and it was unhinged. She claimed that military service didn't put me above the rules, that I was trying to use my deployment as an excuse to shirk my responsibilities, and that the SCRA didn't apply because HOA dues and responsibilities weren't the same as debts or financial obligations. She also informed me that she'd filed a complaint with my chain of command for threatening the HOA with legal action. That complaint went absolutely nowhere. Captain Rodriguez called me into his office looking amused and showed me the email Patricia had sent. It was full of spelling errors, grammatical mistakes, and wild accusations. He'd forwarded it to his superior with a note explaining the situation, and the response had been swift. Ignore the crazy HOA lady and continue supporting the Marine. But Patricia wasn't done. She started emailing me daily. She sent me copies of meeting minutes, violation notices for things like my grass being too long even though I'd hired a lawn service before deploying, and even a bill for her time spent dealing with my non-compliance. The amounts were getting absurd. By mid-January, she claimed I owed the HOA over $800 in fines and fees. I forwarded everything to Major Chen, who was building a case file that was getting thicker by the day. She assured me that none of these fines were legally enforceable, and that Patricia was digging herself into a very deep hole. The problem, Major Chen explained during one of our meetings, is that HOA law varies by state, and Florida gives HOAs quite a bit of power. However, federal law supersedes state law, and the SCRA is federal law. What this woman is doing is illegal, but she either doesn't understand that or doesn't care. So what happens when I get back? I asked. When you return from deployment, we'll help you file a complaint in federal court if necessary. We can seek to have all the fines dismissed, and we can potentially go after her personally for violating the SCRA. The law provides for penalties including attorney's fees, which means if we have to take this to court, she and the HOA could be on the hook for significant costs. That conversation happened in early February. I had 3 more months left on my deployment, and I was starting to dread checking my email. Patricia had escalated from daily emails to multiple emails per day. She sent me photos of my house with nitpicking complaints. She claimed my mailbox was damaged even though my lawn service guy, a retired Marine named Tom who Marcus had recommended, assured me it was fine. She said my house number wasn't visible enough from the street. She complained that I hadn't submitted the proper paperwork for my lawn service, even though there was no requirement to submit such paperwork in the HOA bylaws. Marcus kept me updated on what was happening in the neighborhood. The petition to remove Patricia as HOA president had gained more signatures, but not enough yet for a vote. Several other homeowners were also being harassed, and at least 2 had hired attorneys. The neighborhood Facebook group had become a battleground, with Patricia and her 2 friends, Linda and Susan, arguing with basically everyone else. She's making enemies left and right, Marcus told me during one of our calls. Last week she tried to find the Johnsons because their kid left a bicycle in the front yard overnight, Mrs. Johnson went off on her at the last meeting. It was epic. Someone recorded it and posted it online. Patricia threatened to have her arrested for harassment. She can't do that, I said. Obviously, but that doesn't stop her from trying. She's called the police on 3 different neighbors in the last month. The cops are getting sick of her too. Things came to a head in mid-March. I received an email from Patricia informing me that the HOA was placing a lien on my property for unpaid fines and fees totaling over $1,200. She claimed that if I didn't pay within 30 days, they would begin foreclosure proceedings. That was a mistake. A big mistake. Major Chen had been expecting something like this. She immediately filed a complaint in federal court on my behalf, citing multiple violations of the Service Members Civil Relief Act. She also sent a cease and desist letter to Patricia and the HOA, warning them that attempting to foreclose on the property of a deployed service member was a federal crime. The response was swift. Within days, I received a panicked email from the HOA's actual attorney, a man named Richard Morrison, apologizing profusely and stating that Patricia had acted without consulting him or the rest of the board. He assured me that the lien would be removed immediately and that all fines would be rescinded, but Major Chen wasn't satisfied with that. They don't get to harass you for months and then just say sorry and walk away, she told me. We're going to see this through. The federal case moved forward. Patricia was personally named as a defendant, along with the HOA itself. Major Chen filed a motion for summary judgment, arguing that the facts were clear and undisputed. I was deployed. I had been harassed and fined in violation of the SCRA, and the HOA had attempted to place a lien on my property. She sought a judgment declaring all the fines void, demanding their removal from any HOA records, and asking for statutory penalties and attorney's fees. I was still in Japan when the hearing took place in early April. Major Chen appeared on my behalf, and the judge was apparently not pleased with what he heard. According to the transcript she sent me, the judge had some very pointed questions for Patricia and her attorney about how they thought it was acceptable to threaten a deployed Marine with foreclosure. Patricia's defense was that she didn't think the SCRA applied and that I should have done more to fulfill my obligations. The judge disagreed, strongly. The judgment came down in late April, just a couple of weeks before I was due to return home. The judge ruled entirely in my favor. All fines were voided and ordered expunged from HOA records. The lien was declared illegal and ordered removed. Patricia and the HOA were ordered to pay statutory penalties of $5,000, plus attorney's fees which came to another $3,000. The judge also issued an injunction preventing the HOA from taking any negative action against me or my property for a period of 1 year. But the judge didn't stop there. In a scathing written opinion, he noted that Patricia's actions showed either a willful disregard for federal law or an incompetence that made her unfit to serve in any leadership position. He recommended that the HOA's governing documents be reviewed to ensure they complied with federal and state law, and he ordered Patricia to attend a training course on HOA management and the rights of military service members. Marcus called me as soon as he heard the news. "Dude, it's chaos over here. Patricia is losing her mind. She's been posting on Facebook about how the government is overreaching and how this is tyranny. Meanwhile, everyone else is celebrating. The petition to remove her finally got enough signatures, and there's going to be a special election next week." "Good," I said. "Maybe they'll get someone reasonable in there." "Oh, it gets better. Remember how I mentioned she'd called the cops on a bunch of neighbors? Well, one of those neighbors filed a harassment complaint against her, and the police are apparently taking it seriously. She might end up with charges. I flew back to Jacksonville in early May. It felt good to be home, even though I knew I had some HOA drama to deal with. The first thing I did after unpacking was drive through the neighborhood to see my house. It looked fine. Tom had done a great job with the lawn and everything was well maintained. The next day, I attended my first HOA meeting. The atmosphere was tense. Patricia was still technically president, but barely. The special election to remove her was happening at the end of the meeting, and you could feel the hostility in the room. Patricia saw me walk in, and her face turned red. "You," she said, pointing at me. "You have no right to be here after what you did." I stayed calm. I'm a homeowner in this neighborhood. I have every right to be here. And what I did was serve my country and defend my legal rights when you violated federal law. Several people applauded. Patricia looked like she wanted to explode, but her attorney, Richard Morrison, put a hand on her arm and whispered something to her. She sat down, fuming. The meeting was contentious. Patricia tried to conduct business as usual, but people kept interrupting her to ask questions about the lawsuit, the HOA's finances, and her decision-making. It came out that the $8,000 the HOA had to pay me was coming from the reserve fund, which meant there wouldn't be money for planned repairs to the neighborhood playground and pool. "This is Connor Ashford's fault," Patricia shouted. "If he had just followed the rules and attended meetings like everyone else, none of this would have happened." An older gentleman named Frank stood up. He was deployed overseas defending our country. "My son is Army, deployed to Germany right now, and if anyone tried to pull this nonsense on him, I'd raise hell. You're the one who caused this problem by refusing to listen to reason." The vote to remove Patricia wasn't even close. Out of 43 homeowners present or represented by proxy, 41 voted to remove her. Only her two friends, Linda and Susan, voted to keep her. A new president, a retired teacher named Dorothy Martinez, was elected unanimously. After the meeting, several neighbors came up to thank me for standing up to Patricia. One woman, Rachel, told me that Patricia had made her life miserable for months over a dispute about her fence color. "She's a bully," Rachel said. "Someone needed to stop her, and I'm glad it was you." I thought that would be the end of it. Patricia would fade away, the HOA would get back to normal, and I could focus on settling back into civilian life for a while before my next deployment. But Patricia had one more card to play, and it was even crazier than everything that had come before. 2 weeks after being removed as president, Patricia filed a lawsuit against me personally. She claimed that I had defamed her character, caused her emotional distress, and damaged her reputation in the community. She was seeking $50,000 in damages. I called Major Chen immediately. She laughed when I told her about the lawsuit. "This woman just doesn't learn," she said. "Okay, forward me the complaint and I'll review it. But Connor, I want you to know that this is almost certainly a SLAP suit." "A what?" SLAP stands for Strategic Lawsuit Against Public Participation. It's basically a frivolous lawsuit filed to intimidate someone into silence. The good news is that Florida has an anti-SLAP statute. We can file a motion to dismiss, and if we win, she'll have to pay your attorney's fees again. The lawsuit was indeed frivolous. Patricia claimed that by fighting back against her fines and enforcing my rights under the SCRA, I had damaged her reputation. She pointed to social media posts where neighbors had criticized her, and she blamed me for them even though I'd never posted anything about her online. Major Chen filed a motion to dismiss under Florida's anti-SLAP law, and she also filed a counterclaim for malicious prosecution. The hearing was scheduled for July, and I took a day off work to attend. Patricia showed up without an attorney. Apparently, Richard Morrison had refused to represent her in this lawsuit, probably because he knew it was insane. She tried to argue her case herself, but the judge cut her off repeatedly. "Miss Hendricks, you're claiming that Mr. Ashford defamed you by enforcing his legal rights under federal law." "He made me look bad," Patricia said. "People in the neighborhood turned against me because of him." "People in the neighborhood turned against you because you tried to fine a deployed Marine for not attending HOA meetings," the judge said dryly. "That's not defamation. That's consequences for your own actions." The judge granted our motion to dismiss and awarded attorneys' fees. He also took the unusual step of warning Patricia that if she filed any further frivolous lawsuits, she could face sanctions. I thought that would finally be the end. But in August, something happened that I hadn't expected. Marcus called me one evening, his voice serious. "Connor, you need to know something." The new HOA board was going through Patricia's records, trying to clean things up and make sure everything was organized. They found some irregularities. "What kind of irregularities?" "Money kind of irregularities." Dorothy called in a forensic accountant, and it looks like Patricia might have been embezzling from the HOA. "We're talking thousands of dollars." I felt my stomach drop. "Are you serious?" "Dead serious. Dorothy's meeting with the HOA attorney tomorrow to figure out what to do." This could turn into a criminal matter. It turned into a criminal matter. The forensic accountant's report showed that over the course of Patricia's 6-month tenure as HOA president, approximately $15,000 had gone missing from HOA accounts. The money had been transferred to an account that Patricia controlled, supposedly for HOA expenses, but there were no receipts or documentation for how the money had been spent. Dorothy and the HOA board reported their findings to the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office. A detective named Williams was assigned to the case, and he contacted me as part of his investigation since I'd been one of Patricia's targets. "I've been reviewing your lawsuit and the emails Miss Hendricks sent you," Detective Williams said when we met at a coffee shop near the base. "I have to say, her behavior toward you fits a pattern we're seeing. She was aggressive, threatening, and seemed to believe that rules didn't apply to her." "Do you think she actually stole the money?" I asked. "I can't comment on an ongoing investigation, but I will say that the evidence is concerning. We're reviewing bank records and interviewing other HOA board members. If charges are filed, you'll probably be contacted as a potential witness." Charges were filed in September. Patricia was arrested and charged with grand theft and official misconduct. The grand theft charge was for the embezzled HOA funds, and the official misconduct charge related to her abuse of her position as HOA president. I wasn't called to testify at the preliminary hearing, but Marcus attended and filled me in on the details. Patricia's defense was that the money had been used for legitimate HOA expenses, but she couldn't produce any documentation. The prosecutor pointed out that some of the transfers had occurred right after Patricia had imposed large fines on homeowners, including me, and that the timing was suspicious. The case went to trial in November. I was called as a witness, and I testified about Patricia's harassment of me while I was deployed and the fines she'd imposed. The prosecutor used my case as an example of Patricia's abuse of power and her willingness to bend or break rules to get what she wanted. The forensic accountant testified about the missing money and the lack of documentation. Other homeowners testified about being fined excessively and about Patricia's aggressive behavior. It painted a picture of someone who had taken a position of minor authority and turned it into a personal fiefdom. Patricia took the stand in her own defense, which her public defender had apparently advised against. She claimed that she'd been trying to run the HOA properly, that she'd been following the rules, and that everyone had turned against her unfairly. When the prosecutor asked her about the missing money, she became defensive and angry, insisting that she'd spent it on HOA business but that she didn't keep receipts because she didn't think she needed to. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. They found Patricia guilty on both counts. Sentencing happened in December. The judge gave Patricia 3 years in prison for the grand theft charge and a concurrent 1-year sentence for the official misconduct charge. She was also ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA for the embezzled funds, plus court costs. I attended the sentencing hearing, sitting in the back of the courtroom. When the judge read the sentence, Patricia broke down crying, insisting that this wasn't fair and that she'd been treated unfairly. The judge was unmoved. "Miss Hendricks, you abused a position of trust," the judge said. "You harassed homeowners, including a deployed member of our military. You stole money that was entrusted to you for the benefit of your community. Your actions showed a pattern of believing that you were above the rules and that others should bow to your authority. This sentence reflects the seriousness of your crimes and serves as a deterrent to others who might abuse positions of authority." After the hearing, Dorothy approached me in the hallway. "Connor, I want to thank you for standing up to her. If you hadn't fought back, we might never have looked closely at what she was doing, and she might have stolen even more money." "I just wanted to be left alone," I said. "I was deployed doing my job and she wouldn't stop harassing me." "Well, your refusal to back down probably saved the HOA from even bigger problems. The new board has implemented oversight procedures to make sure this never happens again. We're also reviewing all the bylaws to make sure they're fair and reasonable." Life in Maple Ridge slowly returned to normal after that. The HOA under Dorothy's leadership was reasonable and sensible. They focused on actual maintenance and community improvement rather than nitpicking people's mailboxes and grass height. The neighborhood became a pleasant place to live again. I occasionally thought about Patricia and the whole bizarre situation. It seemed insane that someone could cause so much trouble over something as mundane as HOA meetings, but I'd learned some valuable lessons. I'd learned that it was important to stand up for your rights, even when it was difficult. I'd learned that bullies often back down when confronted with legal consequences. And I'd learned that positions of power, even small ones like HOA president, could attract people who shouldn't have any authority. The story made local news, and then it got picked up by some military news outlets and blogs. I got messages from other service members who dealt with similar issues, thanking me for fighting back. Some of them had been harassed by HOAs, landlords, or creditors while deployed, and they'd felt powerless to do anything about it. My case had shown them that the Service Members' Civil Relief Act was a real protection with teeth, and that they didn't have to just accept being victimized while serving overseas. Major Chen told me that the case had become something of a teaching tool at JAG offices around the country. It was a clear-cut example of SCRA violations and how to properly defend a service member's rights. She seemed proud of that, and honestly, so was I. If my nightmare experience with Patricia could help other military members avoid similar problems, then at least something good had come from it. Marcus and I became closer friends after everything that happened. He'd been my eyes and ears in the neighborhood during the deployment, and he'd had my back throughout the whole ordeal. We got together regularly for barbecues, and our friendship extended beyond just being neighbors. His kids called me Uncle Connor, which made me smile. One evening in January, about a year after Patricia's initial emails had started, Marcus and I were sitting on my back porch, drinking beer and watching the sun set. You ever think about what would have happened if you'd just given in? Marcus asked. Like if you'd paid the fines and let her walk all over you. I thought about it for a moment. Honestly, I don't think it would have ended. People like Patricia don't stop when you give in. They just escalate. If I'd paid those initial fines, she would have found something else to fine me for. And she still would have embezzled that money and probably more. Standing up to her was the only option. True, but it must have been stressful dealing with all that while you were deployed. It was. But you know what was worse? The idea that I was thousands of miles away serving my country and some petty tyrant with a power complex thought she could harass me with impunity. That pissed me off more than the stress. Marcus raised his beer. To standing up to petty tyrants. I clinked my bottle against his. To standing up to petty tyrants. The neighborhood continued to thrive under Dorothy's leadership. She organized community events, fixed actual problems, and treated homeowners like adults rather than children who needed to be controlled. The reserve fund was being rebuilt after the hit it had taken from paying my legal fees and court costs. People were actually happy to live in Maple Ridge again. I got promoted to gunnery sergeant in March, and the neighborhood threw me a small celebration. It was nice to be appreciated by my community instead of harassed by it. Dorothy presented me with a plaque thanking me for my service, both to the country and to the neighborhood. It was a bit embarrassing, but also touching. My next deployment was scheduled for that summer, and this time I had no worries about the HOA. Dorothy had already assured me that they'd handle everything, that my lawn service arrangement was fine, and that I should focus on my duties without worrying about anything back home. That was how it should have been from the beginning. Before I left for deployment, I did one last thing related to the Patricia situation. I wrote a detailed account of everything that had happened and submitted it to a military advocacy organization that helped service members understand their rights. They published it as a case study, using it to educate both service members and civilian organizations about the SCRA and the importance of respecting the sacrifices that military families make. The account got a lot of attention. I did a couple of interviews with military publications, always emphasizing that service members shouldn't just accept being victimized while deployed. The SCRA exists for a reason, and there are resources available to help enforce those protections. I heard from dozens of service members who'd been inspired to fight back against their own situations after reading about mine. One message particularly stood out. It was from a young Army specialist who'd been facing eviction from his apartment while deployed to Afghanistan. His landlord claimed he owed back rent, even though the soldier had been paying through automatic bank transfers. The soldier had felt helpless until he read my story and realized he could contact JAG for help. With their assistance, he'd been able to prove that the rent had been paid and get the eviction proceedings dismissed. The landlord had apparently been trying to break the lease so he could rent the apartment to someone else at a higher rate. "Your story saved my housing situation," the specialist wrote. "I was terrified I'd come home to find my stuff in storage and nowhere to live. Thank you for showing me that we have rights and people who will help us enforce them." That message made everything worthwhile. The stress, the anger, the time spent dealing with Patricia's nonsense, it had all led to something positive. I'd helped not just myself, but other service members who were facing similar challenges. Patricia ended up serving 18 months of her 3-year sentence before being released on parole. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she'd moved to a different part of Florida and was living with her sister. She was prohibited from serving in any HOA leadership position as part of her parole conditions, which seemed fitting. Linda and Susan, Patricia's two friends who'd supported her through everything quietly sold their homes and moved away. Apparently, they'd become pariahs in the neighborhood after it came out that they'd known about some of Patricia's questionable financial practices, but hadn't said anything. No one wanted anything to do with them after that. The Maple Ridge HOA became known in the Jacksonville area as an example of how to do things right. Dorothy implemented transparent financial practices, regular audits, and clear communication with homeowners. Other HOAs in the area started copying their practices. It was kind of amazing how one person's downfall had led to positive changes throughout the community. I deployed again in July, and this time it was completely uneventful from an HOA perspective. I got monthly updates from Dorothy with neighborhood news, but they were informative and friendly, never demanding or threatening. My lawn service kept everything maintained, and I didn't have to worry about anything. That was exactly how it should have been the first time. When I returned from that deployment in December, Maple Ridge felt like home in a way it hadn't before. The neighborhood had come together during the Patricia crisis, and that sense of community had stuck around. People looked out for each other. When someone was deployed or dealing with a family emergency, neighbors helped without being asked. It was the kind of community I'd hoped to be part of when I bought the house. I ended up staying in the Marines for another 6 years before retiring as a master sergeant. During that time, I deployed twice more, and each time the HOA made things easy for me. Dorothy eventually stepped down as president after 4 years, but her successor, a guy named Tom, the same Tom who'd been doing my lawn service, continued her policies of transparency and common sense. Looking back on the whole Patricia situation, it seemed almost surreal. The idea that someone had tried to force me to attend HOA meetings while I was deployed overseas, had fined me over $1,000 for non-attendance, had attempted to put a lien on my house, and had ultimately ended up in prison for embezzlement, it was like something out of a bad movie. But it had all really happened. I kept the printed emails and court documents in a file box in my closet. Sometimes, I'd pull them out and reread them, just to remind myself that it had all been real. The early emails from Patricia seemed almost quaint in their escalating absurdity. The later ones, especially the one about the lien, still made my blood pressure rise even years later. The legal documents told a different story. They were clinical and professional, laying out the facts of the case and the legal arguments. Major Chen's briefs were masterfully written, systematically demolishing every argument Patricia had tried to make. The judge's opinions were scathing in their assessment of Patricia's behavior. Reading them was satisfying in a way that the angry emails never could be. I eventually got married to a woman named Rebecca Foster, a teacher I met at a friend's wedding. When I told her the story of Patricia and the HOA from hell, she was simultaneously outraged and amused. That woman tried to force you to attend meetings while you were deployed. Rebecca said, shaking her head, "What did she think you were going to do, hop on a plane every month?" Apparently, she thought I should attend via video conference, at 3 in the morning my time, since that's when the meetings were held back in Florida. That's insane. What time zone difference were you dealing with? Japan is 14 hours ahead of Florida. So a 7 p.m. meeting there would be 9 a.m. the next day for me. But that wasn't the point. I was deployed. I was working. I had responsibilities that actually mattered. Rebecca was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Did you ever feel like giving up? Like it wasn't worth the fight?" "A few times," I admitted. Especially when she kept escalating and it felt like there was no end in sight. But then I'd think about what my commander said. I was deployed, serving my country, and I shouldn't have to deal with that kind of nonsense from back home. That kept me going. We moved into a different house after we got married, one without an HOA. Rebecca had insisted on that after hearing my story, and I didn't argue. The freedom from having to worry about someone measuring my grass height or judging my mailbox color was liberating. But I kept in touch with Marcus and some of the other neighbors from Maple Ridge. The neighborhood remained a good place to live, and I was glad that my fight with Patricia had helped make it that way. Dorothy had reached out to me a few years after everything ended to tell me that the neighborhood was thriving and that people still remembered what I'd done. "You stood up to a bully when a lot of people were afraid to," she said. "That meant something. It still means something." I thought about that conversation often, especially when I heard stories about other HOAs that had gone rogue or other service members facing similar challenges. The key lesson I'd learned was that standing up for yourself mattered, even when it was difficult, even when it seemed easier to just give in. The Patricia situation had taught me that laws and protections were meaningless if people weren't willing to enforce them. The Service Members' Civil Relief Act existed on paper, but it only mattered because I'd been willing to use it. If I just paid the fines and accepted Patricia's harassment, she would have continued abusing her power and eventually would have stolen even more money from the HOA. Years later, I was contacted by a law professor who was writing a textbook on military law. He wanted to include my case as an example of SCRA enforcement and asked if he could interview me. I agreed, and we spent an hour on the phone discussing the details. "Your case is important because it shows both the protections available to service members and the consequences for violating those protections," the professor explained. "Too many people think they can ignore the SCRA or that it doesn't really matter. Your case proves otherwise." "I was just trying to be left alone," I said. "I didn't set out to be a test case or an example." "The best cases usually start that way," the professor replied. "Someone just trying to live their life who refuses to be victimized. That's when the law matters most." The textbook came out a year later, and there was indeed a section on my case. It felt strange to see my experience turned into an educational tool, but also validating. If law students and JAG officers were learning from what I'd gone through, then maybe fewer service members would face similar harassment in the future. I retired from the Marines in 2032, 22 years after I'd first enlisted. At my retirement ceremony, several people mentioned the Patricia case in their speeches, talking about how I'd stood up for myself and for other service members. It was embarrassing but also touching. That situation, as stressful and absurd as it had become part of my legacy. Rebecca and I settled into civilian life, and I started working as a logistics coordinator for a shipping company. The job used my military experience but without the deployments and time away from home. It was a good fit, and I was happy. But I never forgot the lessons I'd learned from Patricia Hendricks and the Maple Ridge HOA. I'd learned that even small amounts of power could corrupt people who were inclined toward that kind of behavior. I'd learned that standing up to bullies was necessary, even when it was hard. I'd learned that the law could protect people, but only if they were willing to use it. And I'd learned that serving your country shouldn't mean being victimized by petty tyrants back home. Sometimes I wondered what Patricia thought about everything that had happened. Did she recognize that her own actions had led to her downfall? Did she understand that if she'd just accepted my initial explanation about being deployed and left me alone, none of the rest would have occurred? Or did she still see herself as a victim, unfairly persecuted for trying to enforce HOA rules? I'd never know, and honestly, I didn't care. Patricia had made her choices, and she'd face the consequences. The important thing was that the system had worked. The SCRA had protected me, the courts had enforced my rights, and justice had been served when Patricia's embezzlement came to light. The neighborhood had moved on, thrived, and become better. Other service members had learned from my experience and stood up for their own rights. The HOA industry, at least in some small way, had been reminded that they couldn't abuse their positions without consequences. In the end, that was enough. I'd stood up for myself when it mattered, and good things had come from it. Patricia had tried to force me to attend HOA meetings while I was deployed, and instead, she'd ended up in prison for her crimes. There was a certain poetic justice to that. Marcus retired from his job a few years after I did, and we started getting together more regularly for golf and barbecues. We still laughed about the Patricia situation, though with the perspective of time, it seemed more absurd than stressful. Remember when she sent you that email saying you needed to resign from the board you didn't know you were on? Marcus said one afternoon while we were grilling burgers. I thought I was losing my mind when I read that, I replied. Like, how do you get appointed to a board without knowing it? Patricia logic. The same logic that said you should fly back from Japan for HOA meetings. We both laughed, but there was an edge to it. The situation had been serious at the time, and it could have ended much worse if I hadn't had access to JAG and if Major Chen hadn't been so competent and determined. You know what's crazy, Marcus said. If you'd just been a regular civilian without access to military legal services, Patricia probably would have gotten away with a lot more. You might have ended up actually losing your house. I've thought about that, I admitted. The SCRA is a powerful tool, but not everyone knows about it or has access to JAG. Regular homeowners don't have those resources. That's why Patricia was able to bully so many people before she came after me. Well, at least you helped change things for everyone in the neighborhood. Dorothy's leadership was a direct result of Patricia getting taken down. That was true. The silver lining to the whole mess was that Maple Ridge had become a better place to live because of it. The residents had learned to pay attention to HOA governance, to ask questions, and to hold their leaders accountable. Those were valuable lessons that extended beyond just one neighborhood. I heard through the grapevine that Patricia had finished her parole and was working as a cashier at a grocery store in a small town in the Florida Panhandle. She was apparently living quietly and staying out of trouble. Part of me hoped she'd learned something from the whole experience, but I suspected she still saw herself as the victim in the story. Some people never learn. They go through life believing that rules apply to everyone else but not to them, that their authority should never be questioned, and that anyone who stands up to them is the villain. Patricia seemed to be that kind of person. Even facing criminal charges and prison time probably hadn't fundamentally changed how she saw the world, but that wasn't my problem anymore. I'd moved on with my life, built a career, married a wonderful woman, and found peace. The Patricia situation was just a story I told sometimes. A bizarre chapter in my life that had ended years ago. Still, whenever I heard about HOA horror stories or about service members being harassed while deployed, I felt a kinship with those people. I knew what it was like to be thousands of miles from home, doing your duty, and having to deal with absurd demands from people who should have known better. And I always encouraged those people to stand up for themselves, to use the resources available to them, and to fight back against injustice. Because that's what I'd done, and it had made all the difference. Patricia Hendricks had tried to force me to attend HOA meetings while I was deployed, and in doing so, she'd set in motion a series of events that had exposed her crimes, protected other homeowners, and ultimately sent her to prison. Justice had been served, the law had worked, and I'd learned valuable lessons about standing up for what was right. And really, That was the best possible ending to what had started as a nightmare scenario of HOA harassment. The bully had been stopped, the community had been protected, and life had gone on. Sometimes the system works, sometimes justice prevails, and sometimes standing up to petty tyrants makes a real difference. That was my story, and I was proud of how it had ended. Not because I'd wanted to destroy Patricia or ruin her life, but because I'd refused to be victimized and had stood up for my rights when it mattered most. That was a lesson worth learning and a story worth telling.